I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
Mine is 4018. My sister was 40017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day. I'm Jackie Congedo. On this episode, we have author Ed Kruszynski. Ed has published a book called The Medic's Wife, based on the experience of his parents during World War II. His father was a medic who treated soldiers on the beaches of Normandy during D-Day before being among the first to tend to survivors as American soldiers liberated concentration camps. We spoke with Ed about his experience researching and writing this personal story and what he learned about character strengths along the way.
Ed, thank you so much for being my guest today. I'm so excited to get to know you a little better and talk about your book, The Medic's Wife. But before we dive into the book, tell me a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this story.
Yeah, so a little bit about myself. I'm the son of the two protagonists in the book, and there was a catastrophic flood in 2006 that uncovered like a huge cache of World War II memorabilia from my parents' correspondence back in the 1940s. And my dad was a World War II combat medic, and like most of the men that generation, he really didn't talk much about his experiences. And so when we saw what was inside the box, none of us family members had seen any of letters, journals, photographs of my parents during the war, and because my dad didn't want to relive it. But we also learned amazing things about our mother, which was incredibly remarkable. But this book was supposed to be a love story between two people who made it through the war, and somehow or another it became a powerful story about things that my father witnessed in the Nazi concentration camps, and through those correspondences, The Medic's Wife was born, and that's how it all started.
And it's an amazing book. I read it recently, and in my mind, it just played out like a movie. And I love, as you said, it really is a love story. And we'll get into some of that about Ed and Mary and this amazing relationship that we see unfold in the pages. But tell me a little, how did Ed and Mary meet?
So my parents met in 1941. They met working. My dad was, they both were working in a tool and die shop. And my dad said, he saw her across the hallway, and he had this kooky idea of writing up a little story and presenting it to her one day after work. And then as they walked home, he said it was, he couched it as an important work document. She needs to read it at the kitchen table. And it was his way of asking her out through some of the things that they did while they were working. So it was kind of cute. But they went steady. That's a funny word, but that's what they used back in the day. They went steady for 12 months before my dad was drafted.
Amazing. So it was essentially almost love at first sight.
Yeah, on my dad, unfortunately, was ill towards the end of his life and didn't say very much. And 2 days before he passed away, he hadn't spoken like 3 or 4 months. Kind of, was in a catonic state at that point. But he told my mom that she was the love of his life. So, if the good Lord ever gives you like a window of time to break out of whatever thing that you're in, to tell the person you love the most, that they're the love of your life. I thought that was a pretty good thing. So to answer your question, from my mom and dad's standpoint, it probably was love at first sight.
And it was
story.
very touching. Also, how they met, and then also how their relationship evolved. Right, it was interrupted.
Yeah.
He was drafted.
Right, exactly.
How did their relationship change before he was deployed?
Well, the thing is back in the 40s, simple things meant a lot to those people. So my mom and dad were both athletic, both competitive, and their idea of a great date is, an all-out ping pong match, and then the winner would buy the loser a Coke float at Rudy's Five and Dime, and it was all about like innocence and just being normal. And then when the bombs hit Pearl Harbor, everything turned upside down, and the innocence kind of left, not at that point, but later on. But everything was, the story is about what was good and fresh and decent, and it went to places that were the darkest places in humanity, and to actually write about like the good parts, and then what evil really does to human beings. Like, my dad was an innocent guy before he went to the war. He was a 23-year-old kid. He fell in love with this girlfriend, and he went to war and saw and did things that no 23-year-old person shouldn't have to do. And that's the convoluted part of the story.
And you've already mentioned this, that there was a flood, and that's almost this dramatic opening in the book, right? I was there, I felt that, I saw and felt Mary's fear that maybe all of these family treasures were gone forever. And so it's a combination of family archives, U.S. archives, and historical fiction through letters, a lot of letters.
Right.
Can you tell me about your research process, the writing process? How did you put this story together?
Well, at first it was just going to be, a family narrative. I was just going to put the story together for my kids and my kids' kids. We had a hero in the family. But in the flood, when we went through the debris, we found this soggy cardboard box. I mean, we saw it, but the box was filled with photo albums. That was the first part. And these photo albums contained over 200 pictures, but they were submerged in water. So if you remember old-time photographs, we have 1,000 on our phone, you can pull them up instantly. But back in the day, the photographs were in photo albums and they had plastic over them. But the floodwaters had gotten inside the plastic and really damaged all these photos. But we had 200 of them, and you could make things out. And they were very yellow, they had mud splatter. But my mother, when you're 86 years old, she didn't care about money. She didn't care about her belongings. She cared about those photos. And she cared about the correspondences that were inside, the correspondences that she had with my mom and dad. And I kind of, like, when I built the story, if that's what you're asking, I visualized the movie Titanic, where you had old Rose at the beginning telling the old Rose story to her granddaughter, and then it goes back in time for the majority of the movie. She becomes young Rose, and she meets young Jack, and then at the end of the movie, she comes back as old Rose and finishes the story. So that's kind of how I built the book. But to answer your question, once we had the photos, then these photos were only like a postage stamp big. So we digitized them, and that brought out an incredible amount of rich material. I mean, a normal World War II story has a few pictures of the main character, which is usually a man with a headshot with his uniform on. These photos had my dad in the crap, and we knew we had something there. But it was my mother's description of the letters and the journals, and then I went to the United States Archives to validate everything that she was telling me. And My mom was accurate on every count, and the U.S. Archives is a tremendous resource that I didn't know about until I wrote the book. It's free for all Americans. They have a vast amount of historical information that we as citizens of the U.S. have access to. So I found all my dad's records and several different things. So the reason why it's historical fiction is I didn't know the main characters in the book, and when you start adding dialogue, I didn't feel comfortable calling it like nonfiction, like the Band of Brothers. But there's an interesting saying that a historian will tell you what happened, a novelist will tell you how it felt. And I wanted this to be a story, not a book report.
And to fast forward a little bit, only because I feel like even though the story really focuses on Ed and his military service, you get a really a good sense of who your mother was. And one of the really kind of touching pieces is the interview that's discovered with her at the end. I don't want to spoil the book by any means, but tell me what that was like to have her in her own words sharing this story in this 5-hour cell phone interview.
First of all, my mother vowed that she would never tell the story. My dad, when he came back from the war, had difficulty assimilating back into civilian life, like many veterans do. And there was a catastrophic issue between my mother and father. And my dad was distraught. My mother gave him an ultimatum. And they talked everything out. My dad was as open as he could be about everything that had happened, what he had seen, what he had done. And my mom vowed that she would be his biggest coach, but also move forward. We're not going to talk about the past. So at the time that we found all this information, my mother hadn't seen it in 6 decades. She vowed never to break her vow to my dad about telling, what he described to her. And then the part of the marketing is some vows are destined to be broken. So when she actually told the story, it was a powerful thing for all of us to watch and to listen to. When you think about the heroes of the story, I think you'll find at the end that the real hero is not who you think the real hero is. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes. So you've touched a little on your dad's military experience. I want to jump into that because that really is the bulk of what the book focuses on, right, and as well as the wealth of research that you did. We talked about that Pearl Harbor was a major turning point because he was drafted. So also another big piece of his experience, and really 80 years ago this year, would be D-Day. So can you walk us through his military experience, especially those experiences as a medic? Yeah. And how did he choose to be a medic?
Right. So one of the things that makes the story unique is there aren't a lot of books that are from the point of view of a U.S. Army medic. These guys were in the thick of it, and oftentimes they were weaponless. My dad was a medic. He tested well for that kind of thing, and he went through medical training in the U.S. Army. My parents were married at the time, so my mom was living with my dad on base for 18 months before he deployed overseas. And that's a big part of the story. My mom was with my dad when the first German POWs came to America. She saw that. But my dad's experience on D-Day in particular, he led a platoon of 40 medics. My dad rose to staff sergeant. He was always a leader, no-nonsense guy. And he led a platoon of 40 medics, and he was an infantry. So he was his work was he was going to be attached to an infantry unit. They would land on a beach. He and his platoon would be attached to the infantry unit. They'd fight their way to cover, and then they would go up to the cliffs. They'd knock out all the Germans, the batteries, and the artillery fire that the Germans were providing, and my dad would follow the infantry along the way through France. Well, 2 days before they were supposed to land on D-Day, my dad's captain says, well, we're changing. We're taking a Navy assignment. And kind of to cut to the chase, not only did my dad and his platoon land on D-Day, but they landed, some members of my dad's platoon landed over 8 times during the D-Day conflict. So on D-Day, D-Day +1, D-Day +2, which is still very difficult time for the U.S. We didn't necessarily secure safe passage, but for the first 20 days of those D-Day landings, my dad and his platoon were there multiple times to retrieve living and injured soldiers, both Americans and Germans, from the beaches. So, you know, that alone was a story. I could have written a story just on D-Day, and that was just one of the things that he witnessed. But he fought in all 5 major campaigns. When he came back, he was adorned with medals that he didn't care about. He put them in a shoebox, put them in a closet. But then he, as the war progressed, these medics, they see everything. They hardly get a break. Sometimes the infantry units, I don't envy their position either. They fight in the battles and then they move on. The medics are always with wounded or injured, so those guys, they don't catch a break too much. But they're also grizzled. They're tough. They've seen it all. But when my father walked in the Buchenwald concentration camps towards the end of the war, he had the most difficult time describing what it is he saw. They didn't know what they were getting into. They thought they saw every atrocity possible. And when my dad went in Buchenwald, the word atrocity doesn't even come close. It's like a big word that encompasses so much. And there are things that he saw that no one should really see, especially at those ages. Sorry. So ended up being that I think as I read these survivor books from the viewpoint of Jewish survivors, it's about how they survived, their perseverance, their hope and spirituality got them through. But when you're an American medic and you go into the concentration camps, you've already experienced several of the things that camp survivors haven't experienced. And not only did my dad see the camp survivors, but he got to go to places where some of the survivors probably had heard of but didn't see. So these were the most difficult chapters for me to write, because you want to get the wording exactly correct. And atrocities I'll use with my grandchild. Words like medical torture I'll use with you, and some of the other things that he saw in those camps. It's an emotional thing for me personally because I came from Polish immigrants. My family escaped from Poland, and there's a story that my mother told me, and it ended up bearing out that. And there's thousands of these stories, but 2 Polish prisoners in Buchenwald escaped. They were recaptured, and normally the humane way of dealing with that is you would either put them in solitary confinement or you would shoot them. Doesn't sound very humane, but that's what you do when people escape from a prison and you're in war. But the people that ran the camp didn't do that. They beheaded those 2 Polish prisoners, and they shrunk their heads. I mean, these are the things that I'm learning as a son of a man who witnessed those things. They not only shrunk the heads, but they put them on a trophy case as if they went on a safari. And that's just one thing. And I don't know how deep you want me to go on some of these other things, but there are other things that I wrote about that I couldn't even believe. But I think you have to write about this stuff. Because sometimes people think, well, the Holocaust and the concentration camps, they were 80 years ago. It was so far, removed from where we are today. But when you think about it, I was born only 17 years after the concentration camps were liberated. So in my lifetime, it's not that far away. But my dad was in, the concentration camps to treat the survivors. If that wasn't enough, at the end of the war, my dad's platoon was selected to go back into 4 other concentration camps, Dachau being one, to treat German prisoners. What the Americans did is we turned the tables on the Nazis. Not all the Germans were bad, but the American army wanted the German rank and file to see what their government had done, see the secrets that they've been hiding. And German wounded were sent to the concentration camps for treatment. They weren't obviously sent there to be exterminated. They were sent there to be treated. But while they're there, they witnessed themselves what happened. But my dad's unit was responsible for the medical care of German wounded after the war in those camps. So that the guy went through a lot. It's no wonder he didn't speak very much of it.
Yeah, and thank you. You shared so much. Not only I can hear and feel how this discovery process affected you, and it's always hard to imagine how it affected a parent. So thank you for sharing that very difficult piece for yourself, but then a difficult piece of this history. And I'm wondering if part of it not only was a process for you and discovering maybe what you always wondered about your father, but then how much of that today is part of raising awareness. How important is it to you to share this history so that we're learning the impacts of the Holocaust, even though, to your point, it was 80 years ago, right? But why is it important now for a book like this to be out and for people to read it and know what happened?
I think there are 2 things. The first thing is, I wasn't going to publish this book. I finished it. I sat on it for 6 months. And I didn't have the confidence to publish it. I'm a grandfather. I'm not a writer. I guess I am now. But it wasn't until the bombs dropped on the Ukraine that I decided that the story needed to come out. My parents would have wanted me, they wouldn't have kept all this information if they didn't want somebody in our family to do something with it. And I don't know what that thing would have been, but I know that they would have said, you have to put the story out there, because the bombs are dropping on the Ukraine just like they dropped on Poland in 1939, and our family had family there. And I'm not going to try to get too political in my talks, but if Ukraine loses the conflict, then the Red Army borders Poland. And back before World War I, Poland wasn't a country. It was partitioned between 3 other countries. So is it here we go again? I'm not sure. But I think raising the narrative that are we ready for a global conflict is an undercurrent of what this book is. It's a book about love. It's a book about spirituality, survival, but it's also a book about these are the sacrifices that Americans have to make. That's the first thing. The second thing that at least I think of and have learned through the process is these stories, all these stories, survivor stories, World War II books about soldiers that have survived the war. By reading those stories, it's an act of remembrance for them, and you're honoring them. But more importantly, in my point of view, it's an act of defiance against hatred still, because hate's not going to get the last word. I mean, the Nazis burnt books. They tried to rewrite our history. And by writing and reading these books, you're taking your own ancestral strength, and you're saying evil's not going to win. We're going to keep writing. We're going to keep reading these books. And I think that's why books that are around the Holocaust theme are still selling so well. I mean, my books hang in there. It's like the little blue train that could, it's fighting. But there are top 10 books, top 100 books still today about the Holocaust. It's a powerful story.
Yes, and I think, it illustrates the power of human spirit, of perseverance. I mean, we can't shy away from the loss, but also the spirit of survivors persevering and that resilience, which I also read a lot through your father's letters. His perseverance and resilience, all the letters to Mary, it seems like he was trying to really stay positive. And there were a couple times where he himself admitted that he wasn't being as positive as he felt he should, right? Especially writing home to his love. Can you talk about some of the struggles he had, especially, you've already touched on some of the horrendous things he saw, but just speak to his resilience, because that really comes through strongly in the book.
Yeah, I think anytime you're in a conflict like that, and if you're a leader, the moral decisions that you have to make are not always black and white. And I out of the thousands of people that my dad and his friends saved during the war, it was the handful of 3 or 4 that they lost, or what were some of the circumstances revolving about that. So I think about some of the things he was trying to write and trying to explain, and had difficulty doing it. Is I think I took the character test that the Holocaust Museum offers. I did horribly bad on certain things, and I scored better on others. But the thing that I kind of learned from that is there are 2 types of bravery. There's the, I have a weapon and I'm going to take the hill and everybody's going to be behind me, and it's a physical bravery. But I think what the big struggle with people in war is the moral bravery, and my dad struggled with that. Was I brave enough? When I heard cries of medic, medic, did I stay in the foxhole and just listen to him cry and die? I picked a person to go to the front lines and they didn't make it. Those are the things that weighed heavily on my dad's mind. Did I make the right decisions? Because, he was in this war with 3 of his friends, and some of them didn't make it back. My dad felt responsible on some of the decisions that he made. So I think those are the things that he had difficulty with. And I also think, what's more important, moral bravery or physical bravery? And I go back to this book that it's called The Boy from Block 66, and Moshe Kessler says, I watched a courageous man save 1,000 kids. And that was his way of saying that this person had moral courage. You don't always have to be the brave one. But my dad struggled, and I think I do book clubs, which I've learned is a great excuse to have wine at 1:30 in the afternoon. And then if you can talk about the book, then you can get to it. But during these book clubs, everyone that's my age or have had people in the war say, your books help me understand why my relative didn't talk about the things in the war. To me, it's not what they saw, it's what they did, whether it was personal or they didn't do. When they were in the heat of the battle, which way did they go? And I think that's why a lot of people didn't want to talk about the war, and that's why my dad was having difficulty describing what he did, not what he experienced, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you briefly mentioned this, that he did lose a few friends during the war. 2 people that I feel like it was very intentional that you wrote about these 2 individuals specifically and got a little more detailed. And they're very different experiences and relationships that he had. One was with Raleigh, and then a lot of the focus with Dory. And I'm wondering if you can talk about those two and why those two relationships were so, I guess, central to be focused on so much in the book, because they were very touching relationships as I was reading the book. And I think those stuck with your dad, it seems.
When you read stories of war, World War II, as soldiers, as the months go by, they try to not become friends with replacements. You know, people that are, they try not to, because they know, they've seen, if you get close to somebody and they die, you take that more personally. They were trying to inoculate themselves against, they were killing machines. They didn't have time. They didn't have time for feelings. But when you're in a war with 2 or 3 of your best friends, you cannot not be a best friend. And the Raleigh character in the book stuck with both my mother and father all their lives. My mother was right in there. She knew these people. She met their wives. She knew. Raleigh being one of my dad's best friends, losing Raleigh was a difficult thing for him. You know, they rallied around the best they could, but I think my dad had a heavy heart on that one because, you know, like I said, the circumstances are always gray. You always make decisions. Dory is more fun to talk about because if you've ever had a grandchild or kid, any child really that's a toddler, and they put those arms around your neck and they give you a big mushy wet kiss on your cheek, and they just love to be held in an authentic way. My dad was in a war. It was, you know, everything was gray, red, crimson. There was nothing good about it. But when he found that kid and immediately had a bond with her, and she gave him a hug, the touching part is, I think he realized, this is the first time I've ever hugged somebody like this in 2 years, and you know, it was instant love. But then the war was still going on, and everybody, all of my friends and readers, all said we wanted, I can't really say, but we wanted to know more about what happened at the end between those two. Mm-hmm. And I can't really say, because if you read the book, I don't want to be a spoiler, but I think there might be a second book on the Dory experience. But that was something where I had to write over time. The scene where Dory slipped her hand into my dad's and they walked hand in hand out of the concentration camp was a powerful image for me. Because when you're writing these stories, you become these people. And the character Dory also symbolized all the children survivors in Buchenwald. There was more, you know, we don't really know what happened to Dory. We know she wasn't Jewish. She didn't have the tattoo. We're not really sure exactly, but she was an orphan. But my dad saw all the kids from Block 66 as well. And that's another part of the story. But Dory is a sweet part. It's also heartbreaking. It's beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time.
Yes, because it really does, the way you describe her is when he first found her being very disheveled and dirty, and here's this almost angelic little girl who has been caught up in this war and a concentration camp, and then yes, she embraces him, and it wakes up this tender part of him that had been dormant for a couple years, and it's just such a beautiful part of the book, and a reminder of the innocence that is still there during a time of war.
Right. At that moment in time, they needed each other. She was alone. Somebody left her, and you know, he was lonely. So yeah, it was a tender moment, fun to write. But there were times where my office is in my lower level, it's in the basement, and I had to come upstairs a few times, totally disheveled. You know, I'm sobbing, and my wife, who's lovely, said, you need to go upstairs and gather yourself a little bit, and you need to stop writing for a few days, because some of these parts are just difficult to write.
And also, it seemed very difficult for your father as well to write, which is interesting. One of the things I found very interesting is he wrote a letter to Mary about Buchenwald and what he saw, but you mentioned he never mailed it. Why do you think he took the time to write it and share everything he had seen and experienced, and then shielded her from that?
Right. He well, first of all, he was ordered to remember what he saw in those camps. So I think he was writing it down in his journal, which became a letter for himself, and trying to make sense of exactly what it was, because there were things that, how do you describe it? Like, how do you describe it? So he tried to describe it as much as possible. But on my mother's side, if you think about the spouse part, you're latching on to every word. You're reading every letter 4, 5, 6 times. You're reading, accounts of what's going on at war. And I think my dad said, think it's like us. Don't send a controversial email right away. Take 24 hours and look at it. I think I wasn't there, so I'm assuming he took 24 hours and reread it and said, this is not something that you send your wife, who is hoping and praying that you come back. So he didn't send it. Also, you should know that all these letters and the journals, they were handwritten, some in pencil, some in ink. They weren't protected in the flood. So they were, some things were unlegible. But if you're the spouse of a soldier that were sent these letters, you know almost every word. So that was the powerful part of my mom's testimony, is she didn't need the letters to tell us what happened. I needed her to tell me what happened, so I could go and say, is this really happened? And that's where the U.S. Archives came in, and Ancestry.com to validate all of those things. But to answer your question, I don't think he sent the letter because it's not a letter you would send, I don't think. So that's why.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. What all do you know about your mother's experience during the war being stateside?
Her story is just as incredible as my dad's. First off, I go back to the book clubs, and I ask a question. I'm like, okay, most people, at least the book clubs I've given, are AARP members like myself. We're at a certain age, and I have to get them back to when they were 20 or 21 years old. Think of yourself as a 21-year-old man or a woman, and you dated somebody for 8 or 9 months, and the war breaks out, and you have to decide whether you want to get married or not. And the person asks you to get married. The question is, what would you do? Would you say yes to your boyfriend, your love of your life? Would you say yes? And almost every person, usually it's women because this question is geared towards the women, say, yes, I would marry my boyfriend before he goes off to war. And then I flip the question. I say, well, now be a parent or a grandparent, and your daughter who's 21 comes and says, I'm going to marry my boyfriend and he's going off to war. 80%, those same people, who are the same people, raise their hand and are like, absolutely not. They're not going to get married. So my mom's parents didn't approve of the marriage for those reasons. Can't you wait until afterwards? So it was an interesting kind of case study. But my mom herself she was a warplane parts inspector and took her job seriously. She worked for a company called Jack and Heinz in Cleveland. They won a contract from the military, and they made warplane parts. My mom was an inspector with her best friend, and she worked 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts, and had 1 day off a month. And she did that for 2 years, and she saved all of her money. And when my dad came back, she and my dad used their savings to buy their first store. But my mom worked 30 days in a row, got one day off, 12-hour shifts. How do you do it? How do you do that? One other touching part of the story is, you think about the sacrifices that generation had to make. There was rationing going on in the United States. And so my mom knew that her little brother needed shoes. I also did an inventory on my shoes, and it's embarrassing. I'll explain that in a second. But my mom's family, my mother, they got their points and they got their coupons assembled, and they bought my Uncle Ray his pair of one shoes. You get one pair of shoes a year, and they bought him his shoes. So I go back and I think, gosh, I looked at my closet and I don't feel like I have a lot of shoes, but when you do the count, it's a double digit, and I'm like, wow, I take a lot for granted. But my mom was thrifty. She was smart. She squirreled away money in her condo. That's actually part of the reason why we went after the box. She hid money in books underneath counters. But in terms of how moms are, you would never know that. She never talked about her experiences either. She was our biggest cheerleader. As a kid growing up, both our parents were. They wanted the best for us. And I mentioned early on, if you read the book, it'll be up to you to decide who is the real hero in the story. And if you ask me a question about my mom and dad, I have my own opinions on the hero. And we wouldn't be here if Mary didn't tell the story.
And I think her strength really comes through in how she helps your father adapt post-war. And so I want to touch a little on what that experience was like, because we've already talked about the silence, right, of not sharing the experiences. But what was striking, and something that I don't think most people think about, is the reception of everyday Americans to soldiers returning home. And sometimes I hear this from survivors as well. It's not always as warm. And a lot of times some of the comments and the things that are said and the way someone's treated is very tone deaf. And I think there were a couple of things that you describe that really then leads to how your mom becomes really his guardian, almost essentially, like socially, and a guardian of the story, and your dad's recovery and journey through PTSD. And I'm wondering if you can share a little about him coming home and what reintegrating into society really was for him and them as a couple.
The most difficult part for my father when he came home was the abruptness of him coming back to civilian life. He was in Starnberg, Germany, administering to patients in Dachau. His commanding officer said, "You have enough points, you can go home." 11 days later, he's in the United States. And there's no war in the United States. It's people are moving around, they have their lives, they're going to work, they're talking about Christmas, they're shopping, there's lights, there's a surplus of goods and services, and it was overwhelming, I think, for my dad to like the shock of like, do these people have any idea what we went through? And he had real difficulty with friends or acquaintances or family members that weren't involved in the war, right or wrong. He did. And especially with people that profited from the war. My dad he was a staff sergeant and got paid as a staff sergeant would. People that worked in war factories, they were paid on a different pay scale. So I think it was difficult for him on that, but still I don't know what it's like to have PTSD. I don't know what it's like to be shell-shocked, PTSD is a great scientific term, but my dad was shell-shocked. That's like, he was shocked from war. He was still in the war when he came home. So like when your eyes are open and you're moving about your day, there's enough distractions where you're only thinking about it sometimes. But when you close your eyes at night and your subconscious takes over, my dad was back in the war. I don't know for how many months he was there, but there was something catastrophic that happened between my mother and father that made my mother confront him about not being the same person. You know, I was a little offended by that in a way. I'm like, well, you know, how could he? How could he? But you know, when you are now a 26-year-old wife and your husband, you haven't seen him in 2 years, and he comes back and he's in these dark places, she confronts him. She did as much as she could, but he clammed up, and she said, basically, if you don't start talking to me to help me help you through these things, I cannot keep going this way. And that's where we call it tough love. You know, when you're a kid, your parents gave you tough love, but mom gave dad some tough love right there, and he had to decide how much or how little he was going to do to save his marriage. And the next day, the way she described it is he was at the kitchen table and he told her everything. One time. He said, one time is all you get. He told her everything. And when I say everything, it's mostly the moral decisions he had to make that were bothering him the most. So oftentimes, like before I wrote the book, you know, when we say survivors or soldiers talk about their experiences, that's kind of in broad context. It's really those moral decisions that they had to make when no one was looking, that my dad had to explain in some way that my mom would understand it. And you know, mom was not always forth. She didn't tell me that they spent 24 hours. She didn't get into the, you know, the gnat's ass details of every single thing, because she's protecting her family. But one of the things, my mom was as street smart as they came, and she knew that she couldn't tell anybody after that conversation, because she didn't want to, if she told her children or her sisters or mom and dad or, you know, whoever wanted to know, well, what happened? People would ask my dad these questions and trigger these insidious thoughts again. And, you know, my dad was a strong human being, and he was not prone to violence, but when you're in a dream state, you're not yourself. So, you know, she didn't want to have anybody fear him or have him go down these bad rabbit holes. But to his credit, you know, they didn't have treatment for this kind of stuff back then. Maybe they did. I don't know. I didn't research that part. But my mom and dad they put together their own self-help program. My dad hung out with friends that had went through the war. My mom said they actually had some conversations about things that were bothering, and eventually time heals all.
And he did some work with veterans who came back and had PTSD in later years. And,
Yeah.
and I think that's a beautiful aspect, that we most certainly know he had the same trauma, and then he was able to work through some of his own while helping other veterans.
Right, exactly. The Veterans Administration hospitals were a big thing for my dad when he retired. I think he enjoyed going and talking to other wounded veterans, because they're in a unique fraternity. And I don't know how deep my dad was counseling, you know, other veterans on PTSD, but I think towards, you know, when he was in his 70s, he was more apt to speaking to selective groups about his experiences. He never spoke to his kids about it, but he would speak to other soldiers of some of the things. And there is kind of a funny story here. Like, so I'm an uncle, you know, I have nieces. My dad would tell stories to my nephews, you know, the son-in-laws. And my brother and I and sister would be like, well, he still hasn't talked to us. What did he say to you guys? So like we would still, share stories, but your parents are always your parents and they're always shielding you for certain things. But we did squeak some information out of my nephews on what they learned. But yeah, I think it helps veterans sometimes to talk to other veterans.
So as we're rounding out our conversation, I have one question that is kind of three parts. So I'm looking for three answers here.
Okay.
So our theme this month is strengths and action. And as you mentioned, we focus a lot at the Holocaust Center about our character strengths and how we can use our strength to affect change, positive change in our community. And I'm wondering, what did you learn about your own strengths in writing this book? But then what did you discover about your parents that you maybe didn't know going into this and their strengths?
What I learned about myself through this whole process is bravery is a character strength. I didn't score very well on bravery in the test. I took it as, Napoleon. I'm Napoleon. I don't know if I could go and, have a gun. But what I learned is some of the things that I also scored middle on were things like forgiveness, things like fairness, and those are tough pills to take even at my stage of the game. But one thing I learned in a long career is self-assessment and self-awareness are two things that are important for you to improve yourself. The things, character strengths that I was good at were things that I knew I'd be good at. Creativity, humor, gratitude, those kind of things. Those all popped. But the things that didn't pop were kind of eye-opening. So I think self-assessing myself, like, I need to put things behind me. I need to forgive better. In terms of like, how do you make it through, how are you a survivor of a concentration camp? How do you make it through a war? I think things like, at least from what I've read on survivors, things like hope, spirituality, perseverance, those are character traits that a lot of survivors needed to have to make it through. It's easy to give up. But if there was a survey of all the survivors, I wonder if they would score high in all those areas, because I don't know how you would make it unless you'd have hope. Every day, every hour, every minute was a struggle. How do you do it? So from a character standpoint, I think those three things from a survivor standpoint would be important. I think my dad, his character strengths would be prudence, teamwork, and judgment. He's a leader. I think about character traits and teaching those early, so our children understand what the right traits are, and what ones are really important and why they're important. But the children in Germany were being taught similar traits. I think part of it is who's doing the teaching and what's right and wrong. It's not like Germany, if you take a look at the pictures, the Hitler Youth, we see them as those are the villains, but they were being taught the same things. Bravery, spirituality, fight for the fatherland, God's with us, those kind of things. And my brain's not big enough to wrap myself around how you not do that. The only thing I can think of to answer your question on something like that would be, who's doing the teaching, and is it what's right and wrong? So I think about some of that stuff a lot, and certainly more, thoughtful about things. What I say to people when they ask me questions, and there are things that still bother me, and things that I'm unsettled about. Did I answer that?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think you're right. Strengths, we all have these strengths, right? And
Right,
unfortunately,
right.
they can be used to hurt, but hopefully, if we're inspired to and know that we're empowered to, we can also use them to help and heal, right? And so my last question for the day, unfortunately, because there's still so much we could have talked about this book. When people hear your family story, what do you want them to take away most from what you've written?
You know, I think what I would want people to take away is that there are hidden heroes that walk among us every day. And oftentimes true heroism goes unnoticed or unspoken. And these stories help illuminate telling a story of a person who might not be able to tell the story. And I think the moral of the story is evil never wins. Good always wins. Good always wins. And I know it probably wasn't the answer that you wanted, but that's how I'm thinking this book ends up, is, to me, writing it, my family's legacy, at the end of the day, good beats evil always. And if you get some of that from the book, then I did my job.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for speaking with me today, for writing this book, for keeping this history alive, and sharing very intimate and vulnerable things about your family, just so that we can be inspired by these stories of history. And thank you for doing that work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. There is one other thing, though, and that's I'm planning on donating the proceeds of this book, a portion of the proceeds. Whenever the podcast is being aired, whatever month, that'll be the month where my family, the Kruszynski family, will donate my portion of the profits back to the Holocaust and Humanity Center as our gift to the center.
Thank you so much for that. That's very generous. Thank you.
You're welcome.
To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling and is generously supported by Margaret and Michael Valentine. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Executive producers are David Wise and Jackie Congedo. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kingman. Technical producer is Robert Mills. And technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kick Lee. This is recorded at Technical Consulting Partners Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.